Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining the Gentlemen's Assembly today. We're going to be discussing the book Defending Dixie's Land with its author, Jeb Smith. And right off the bat, I'd like to ask you why you went with the alias of Isaac C. Bishop for this text.
Yeah, it's I somewhat regret it now. I didn't think it would be as popular as it's become. I didn't think it would be a whole lot of sales. I thought it'd be friends, family. It was my first self-published book. And just growing up in Vermont, there's a lot of hostility towards the South. And, I have four kids, and I didn't want to negatively affect them in any way, even socially, having their teachers hear about it or something like that, even though we were homeschooling most of them. But it was mostly somewhat a protection for the kids in a way. And now, as you see, if you on my Amazon site, I've gone back and I made it clear there's a pen name. I'm Jeb Smith. I'm now associating myself with the book, whereas before is, just I didn't want any negative effects on my children growing up.
Yeah, I kind of assumed that. And for the book, I wanted to ask if you were just with someone who you might want to give the basis of this to, what would be your elevator pitch for the book to someone?
I would say the winner writes the history, and the American Civil War is a prime example of that. And that's basically what I try to do. I try to look at everything from what slavery was like, what the causes of secession were, Abraham Lincoln, and I just think there's so many prime examples to demonstrate that the winner writes the history. And so, if you want to learn everything that you haven't been told or that you don't hear through the general forms of information in America, it's a great book to get all that information on so many different subjects related to Civil War. And even if you don't agree with me on a lot of things, I think anyone will walk away from the book say, there's something intentional going on here where we have information withheld. What's the reason for that? So you don't have to like the South, you don't have to like the Confederacy, what they fought for, but you'll be able to open your mind and see that we're not given the whole truth about a host of issues, and the Civil War is just a prime example to demonstrate it. And I think this book does that very well. Looks at a lot of different angles, a lot of different subjects, and you'll gain that sort of information and say, wow, there's a lot we're not being told, I guess.
Right. And I saw that you had referenced some things uh, to do with the Abbeville Institute, which is
Mhm.
one of the groups that I had gotten interested into when I was learning about these things as well. And I wanted to ask, what would you say the biggest misconception about the Confederacy or the Civil War was?
Yeah, that's great. In the book, I say that I think it's Abraham Lincoln. And I think growing up in Vermont, that may be true. He was presented as kind of a saint of a figure, someone who saved America, saved the Constitution, emancipated all the slaves, was a fighter for racial equality and all that kind of stuff. And none of that is true. And so that is a huge, definitely a huge area that I would say. But, as just for this podcast, I was just scanning through my book, um, rereading a lot of the material. And I think there's so many things to go with. It's very hard to say, but I would say that even the way the races were handled north versus south, like a lot of people think of the north as the more seeking equality and all that, and the south generally had legal slavery, so did the north in certain states, but the way they interacted with the different races was much more like we do today, whereas the north was much more about segregation and racism. The way they treated the Native Americans, anyone that got in their way, they sought to exterminate. They did the Native Americans, they did the South, they segregated the blacks. So it's anyone that's not like them, they're very discriminatory and intolerant of. And that's not the picture that's given us. Whereas the South was much more live and let live attitude. And so that would be a big difference. But it's tough to say. I mean, slavery, I think it's tough to say slavery was one way or not. So it's hard to place that. But the way a lot of slaves lived, no one today, if you're not familiar with the material, would think that because we only get the worst, the very worst examples. So in a way, slavery is, but at the same time, there's horrible things that happen in slavery. So I'd have to go maybe with Lincoln or the way races are treated. But there's many shockers, I think, to people who learn the standard winners version of the war that everyone may select a different issue, that they're more surprised because they may have heard something slightly different than I did.
Right, right. And the book definitely has earned its uh 4.5 stars that I saw on Amazon because it's just jam full of a lot of references really to, so many quotes, so many different references. And especially in the part about slavery, there's a lot of quotes to the slave narratives,
Mhm.
which I found pretty valuable. Uh, I would ask, uh, in your perspective, if the South had been allowed to secede peacefully or would have won the Civil War, how might have that affected history up to now?
I've wondered that in my mind many times. How are you talking somewhat worldwide? I think it could have had a reaction. It could have had a reactionary conservative sort of thrust among society. And especially in the South, like I said, I think it would have turned into a aristocracy or, bordering on some form of monarchy. But I think it would have been more of a figurehead than an actual monarch. But it's really tough to say. I think it would have, because America became the most influential country over time, and I'm not sure that would have happened had the South seceded. I don't think America would have the great influence it has for good or for bad across the world. I think it would have been more involved only with its own domestic concerns, and you would have had the South a very different. I mean, the wealth would have traveled south for sure. So they may have been the prominent example, and they may have influenced every Europe and in the other continents because they would have had the free trade, like I talk about in my book, and the tariffs. And so all the trade would have been going through the southern ports, which is why the North couldn't allow them to go because they would have been really hit hard on their income because it came primarily through tariffs at this time. So if the South is allowed to go, it's already the wealthiest section of the United States, which means they're losing all that tax. The North is really stealing from the South. The South is paying for Northern projects. They're going to lose all that money. And now all the trade's going to go through the South. They likely become the most powerful economic country in the world, and everyone's kind of looking to them the way they did America. And they're going to go in the opposite direction as the North is going more towards democracy, liberalism, and things like that. And it's going to kind of a reactionary aristocracy and obviously the slavery thing. So I think it could have had a huge effect across the world, but it's really hard to guess how that would have played out and how long other countries would have tolerated a slave holding country ruling or being the top nation in the world. And would more countries be okay with slavery? Would it promote that or not? I'm not sure that it would, but it'd be interesting to see how long the Confederacy would last, how it with slavery intact and still be a world trade leader, I guess.
Uh, One thing
Right.
I find really interesting about your book is that you posit that the early United States had both Enlightenment and pre-Enlightenment more medieval influences,
Mhm.
and that the sort of medieval influences would begin to concentrate more so in the Southern society, whereas the
Right,
Enlightenment influences would concentrate more so in the
right.
Northern society. And I'd really like if you could go into some detail on that and just talk about that.
Yeah, I think the Enlightenment, what America was trying when we separated hadn't really been done. And by the time the Civil War came around, the South especially saw what was going on in the North and the philosophies and the things they were accepting from the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. And they were saying, maybe we were wrong on some of these things and we don't want to go that route because now we're seeing the result and we're going to end up like the North if we do that. And I think they looked back at things that had worked in the past. And, you know, we had a lot of medieval ideas throughout the Enlightenment in the Founding Fathers, but it was those sort of ideas, especially politically and practices, that they said, this is how we preserve liberty. We don't follow the North and go with their philosophies. We need to go back even further to where to the Middle Ages before the even the Reformation and the Enlightenment. And they said, you know, we were wrong on a couple of things. And that way, I think it was a reactionary movement. And I think, especially after secession, there's a stronger movement towards that, but they were busy in war. And that's why it's really hard to dictate or to assume where the South would have went through the war, because there's those reactionary forms that were present and strong, but at the same time, you had a central power that was trying to, their central government trying to fight a war. And so you have really a lot of things going on in the South to see how, or to guess how, if everything's settled, where they would end up is very difficult. But there's definitely the movement, especially in the aristocracy, political and decentralization and all that, to go back to the Middle Ages. And for whatever reason, the culture was more towards monarchy, more towards the old forms of Europe in the South. I heard one historian, I can't say if that is true, but he said during the Revolution, you had New England, which was two-thirds for the Revolution, one-third for staying loyal to Britain. He said the central states were half and half, and the southern states were two-thirds to stay with the monarch and King George, and only a third wanted the revolution. So America was very split during that time. And I think just the culture and where people populated in America, they were always more in the South attached to Europe, and they you know, learned what parts to reject and which parts to hold on to over time, and by watching the North. And those were, you know, they held on, I noticed, a lot to the more medieval ideas, and they let go of the Renaissance.
Right. I was also curious because in this defense, I've talked, we've talked before in our missing monarchy discussion, and there was the group that was formed in the 90s called League of the South,
Hmm.
which was uh, co-founded by Tom Woods, who's a pretty big libertarian.
Right, yeah.
What would be your thoughts on them?
I don't know enough of the League of the South. I didn't even know Tom Woods started that. I know Clyde Wilson was involved, but I haven't really associated enough or interacted with them to know fully what they're about. Um, is it about a restoring the South,
It is
a movement?
it's a secessionist political party in
Mm-hmm.
favor of a libertarian version of the South. Very interesting thing they mentioned on their core values was that they believe in allodial land, which means land with no property tax, for
Mm-hmm.
one, means you would also have some direct rights over your land.
Mm-hmm.
And that pretty much went away with feudalism. When feudalism went
Right.
away, you kind of lost allodial land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be all for that. That sounds good. I mean, both of those authors I have read and loved. And Clyde Wilson wrote that great review of Dixie, but I would think any sort of, you know, secession movement that's Southern libertarian, I would be in favor of for sure. And I quote Tom Woods at some point in the book. I think in the old times they're not, or um, the old times are gone with the wind, I think is the one that the final chapter. And I quote Tom Woods in his book on nullification. As you know, if you read Dixie, I use some of his examples that he gives in his books of nullification in during the time of the Union before the Civil War. But he mentions how the American founding fathers in the South went back to the older medieval ideas even before, and so he made that connection as well, that the South in you know, is very feudal and private property is obviously a big thing because if your central government controls everything, they can then regulate your property as well. Whereas that feudal system, it's localized and it's your own. It's not the central powers. And that's one of the things about the South and the plantation system that really kept that intact to a great extent. And the North was doing the opposite. But yeah, I'm not familiar enough with League of the South. I've heard of them, but not really read up on them, I guess.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I mean, I hadn't much heard of them. They aren't as, they may not be as libertarian as they were, but still in their core principles that they hold to a lot of libertarian values. It's basically, you can see Tom Woods written all over it.
Yeah.
So I would also ask if someone did want a more, reactionary conservative Christian society
Mhm.
like the Confederacy was, what might be a good method to start getting to that? What would be the first steps to get towards that?
For us today,
Yes.
I would say the whatever the League of the South is doing, it had to be some form of secession. And if the South did it as a whole, I think it'd be a strong enough block to to be able to maybe accomplish it. If it's one small little area in America, it's not going to happen. That's one of the bad things I think about somewhat Trump and the conservatives or more conservatives winning because it keeps people, as I talk about in monarchy, it keeps people in line because they feel like they have a chance. They feel like they're winning these little successes. But you watch America in 20 years, it's going to be even more authoritarian than it is. So you really need secession is the only way in my mind. I mean, you need to convince local people to run, whether it's Senate or state positions, really. You don't even need federal. You need counties leaders and state representatives to buy into the idea of secession. But it's very difficult when the people who gain from being elected that are part of the politics of America to go against it. So it would really need to be a grassroots movement. Something would have to ignite it, I think. You'd have to, the government would have to go too far in some area to really upset a lot of people, and it'd have to be like an emotional response that people want. Okay, now we need out of this country because it's become so awful. And so that's the only way I could see it occurring. I mean, there's the education part, like you guys are doing podcasts, spread ideas, let people realize what type of government we're under, that we're not free, educate people on alternatives. I think the school choice, if that happens and people are able to be homeschooled and not go to government school, that could be huge because people are going to think more independently. They're going to come up with ideas on their own and they're not going to be so conforming to what's already in place. So to me, the biggest way to do that would be education, and that something like this down the line could happen as people are educated, that they could then get their local representatives to some form of movement for secession. But things like Trump winning and the Republicans winning in the South, most everyone's Republican or conservative, and they're going to look at examples like these and use it as, oh, we can win. We just need to, get enough people to vote again. And it keeps everyone somewhat compliant, complacent with the system. So we need a shock. Something has to happen, something big to get an emotional response, I think, in a way.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with all of that and somewhat. It was funny during the election season, I told a lot of conservatives that I was a Kamala supporter just because I wanted to get a shock into the system.
Yeah.
Uh, but with the secession uh, movement, I've seen statistics from the last maybe election cycle, maybe before that, where a good percent of people in a lot of states, nearly 50%, were interested in secession.
Hmm.
And even in Texas, there's the Texit
Yep.
movement, which has gotten, I'm not sure exactly how popular, but I mean, even their governor, I believe, was talking about actually going through with it at one point.
I don't blame them with all the illegal immigrants coming over their border that they have to deal with that, is against their population and their want. So there is that. And you're right. I think also Colorado and where else did I hear? Some Illinois, I think some counties want to join another state because they're being controlled by Chicago and stuff, and they don't like that politics. So even if it happens on a small scale, I know there's a movement in California too, which would be awesome if they broke off.
Yeah.
If it can happen somewhere, you're right, it'll catch fire because other people will look around and be like, wait a second, what are we doing? Why are we all stuck in the same system? Let's move to how we want. I would love California because they're strong enough, and I don't see the American government doing something if California broke off. And then all the liberals will start moving to California and enjoy it there because that's their system. The conservatives will move out, and everyone will be like, wait a second, we don't have to be all under the same system. We could do this in other places as well. So you're right. Maybe I'm too negative in my views, but yeah, if secession may have a better chance than I think, and it may not even need. Well, for the left, Trump being elected and the Republicans having full control could be a shock to them, and they're in once they start implementing stuff that they really don't like. Hopefully, that can encourage people in California to say, "We've had enough. We want to break off and form a more liberal nation." In which case, I'd say that's awesome. Go for it. You know.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely would be because, and it's the most logical thing too, because when you think about it, why fight over the sandbox when you can just have your own? You can
Right.
just do your own thing, have your system, no watering down with consensus,
Hmm.
and do it one way. But for some reason, I believe it's mostly due to centralization propaganda. Usually, I think I should just ask you this. What do you think about someone saying, well, if states began to secede, then China or Russia would just take us over so easily?
I think that's more fear mongering than what's actuality. I saw I think it was Tom Woods. He put out an article on a libertarian site, and he was talking about if North Carolina seceded from the Union, they'd be like the 12th biggest economy in the world. America is so far ahead military wise that, for one, I don't think we should be involved across the world. I don't think we should be in all the wars that we are and involved. So I don't think we need to be the ruler. I think we just need to protect ourselves. And so I don't think we need to be as powerful. And there's nothing wrong with, like, if California seceded, I don't see any reason why America and California would not have an alliance, be close allies, and help each other out in a military situation. We're going to have to work out the trade agreements and all that as well. So you can be friends and you can help people out without being in the same country. And I find it hard to believe if China, say California left and China invaded, that America is not going to say, if you invade California, you're at war with us as well, sort of like the UN does. And America can handle itself. I think it's a lot of fear that people use to keep us together. That's not really needed as much anymore. And I think an alliance can stave off the if it came to that, it could help us out as well.
Yeah, it's weird to me that it seems more absurd to some people that there could be any type of decentralized type of alliance thing than
Hmm.
it would be that, they just, I don't know, they'd be attacked for some reason.
Right. I
I
just
find it very odd.
I think those days are over. And there's a quote by Lincoln talking about my book. He said, "If America falls, it's not going to be from some country across the ocean. It'll be from within." And that's where, to me, I guess maybe my biggest threat is not China taking us over. I think our economy, they're too dependent on us, and we're too dependent on them. We're going to want to work things out. But our biggest threat is from Washington, D.C., in my opinion. Like, America's been destroyed from within, but they'd rather stay together in case China perhaps would invade us. Very unlikely. How about our politicians, our Supreme Court have already destroyed America? They've already gutted us from within. but they don't want to do anything about that. We're so busy looking for tyrants across the ocean that we miss them in numerous tyrants going on every day in America and the laws that, and so it's like that's not our biggest threat. Our biggest threat has already been accomplished and is being accomplished every day. And so that's what we need to fight, not potential Chinese invasion.
Right, and you can see the how would I put this, the pattern of the Civil War continuing into the future because the Civil War was, I believe it is still the bloodiest war on our side in American history. And from then on, we continued on to intervene more in military conflicts across the globe.
Right.
And it has been against sometimes reactionary forces. I mean, when they were fighting the Taliban lately, they were fighting a group that was considered reactionary, but
Hmm.
they won amazingly, I suppose, against the U.S. with their, uh, I don't know, guerrilla tactics.
Yeah.
And yet, some people in the U.S. still think that, oh, the government has guns. Nobody could ever win if they became tyrannical. Uh,
Yeah.
Likely not so. But do you think that the trend of military global imperialism by the U.S. government would continue if it were more decentralized, like the Confederacy had been? Would the Confederacy have had more imperialism than the U.S.?
I don't think so at all. I believe I quote Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis both saying if the North wins, they're going to, it's not going to end with the South. They were warning the Native American tribes, I believe. They said they're going to put you on plantations, they're going to regulate you, they're going to, impose all these things, kick you off your land, destroy your way of life. And they said it's not going to end with the South. They're going to then turn and go global. So it's definitely the centralized mindset that the North had, and I think it derives from some Puritanism, but of replacing everyone else, remaking them in your own image. So they would not have had as much power, especially economically, to do that. So they would have had their intentions, but they would not have been able to achieve them as easily had the South left. And the South was very libertarian in that way with foreign. They said, we want to be at peace with everyone and we just want free trade. And that's what the goal of the government is, to establish free trade to protect that and be at peace with everyone. So the South had a different mindset, and I don't think the South would advance technologically as much as the North because they didn't have the Industrial Revolution. And so I think while they would have started out as a supreme military power, I don't think they would have kept that going. I think they would have economically been so. And they still would have been one of the major players in the world, but neither the North or the South would have the same sort of power to do what America has done united. And that's where the argument that you said of people keeping the US together. But I mean, I don't think we need that power because I don't think it's a good thing in a lot of ways what we've done with it, and that's not needed. You should be protecting your own people, not ruling the world and conforming them to your own image. So military should be a defense of your country, in my opinion. And so, yeah.
Right. I believe it has degraded America in many ways where even the people who would have been more like the founding stock, like Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, these people, they've they've pretty much given away their own country to try and make a United States of Earth rather than a
Yeah.
United States of America. And I I guess I would say that somewhat recently I've seen some more right-wing people use Lincoln as their big guy. They love him,
Hmm.
but I mean, even Christian nationalist type of people. But
Hmm.
what would you say after reading all you have about Lincoln's probable religious affiliation?
With it, I've read more towards the negative of that. It's really hard to say. I've read more the arguments that he was not Christian, that he was more of a deist. He definitely seems to fit that way, and he's definitely a politician talking to a Christian audience. So he'll use a lot of biblical language and things like that to help convince his people of whatever he's trying to do. So he's a savvy politician. But as far as if he was actually a Christian, because I know the Christian right uses him quite a bit, that I don't have enough to say on that for sure. But I know it's debatable. I would say he seems more like a some form of deist to me. I think he was definitely you know, believed in a God. I don't know if it's the creator. And a lot of people say he became a Christian after Gettysburg or later when his son died. But I don't know for sure on that one.
I believe I think he was one of the presidents to reject a Christian nation amendment, which would have amended the Constitution to include religious affiliations.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of Christians that would do that today as well. So I wouldn't say that's a complete determiner. That's more the separation in church and state mindset. But
Well, I would only say I don't believe that his motivation was separation of church and state if he were a Christian.
right, especially
I
at
don't
that
think he
time.
would have
At
cared.
that, that's true. That's true. That separation church state came much later. So,
Right, right. Uh,
Uh, one major aspect of your book is that you cover a lot of uh, you look at slavery historically and you attempt to give it uh, a better portrait as a social institution because you
mhm.
make the argument that a lot of literature concerning the relation of slaves to their masters is really one-sided towards an abolitionist view,
Yep.
where even if it's morally unjustified, fundamentally, it's historically inaccurate to paint it where everyone just has this horrible relationship to their master. And you
Mhm.
talk about positive relationships between slaves and their masters frequently in the book, and I'd like if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. The history we've gotten on slavery is largely affected by politics because you had the abolitionist movement, the fight over the Western territories, which was not a moral issue about slavery, or very little. It was more economic and political. And so, just like today, if you watch politically motivated news sources, you'll find a lot of slant, a lot of misinformation on both sides. They're trying to do it. They're trying to convince their audience of one position or another. And it was the same thing back then. And so most of our sources, if you read or in any school textbook, you look at the sources, you look at what they cite, they're generally runaway slaves who endured the worst of slavery. Obviously, they ran away from it. In those cases are real. Or they're abolitionist material at the time, which are politically motivated, and they were not like considered accurate historical documents to be considered, oh, this is what slavery is like. So we're getting the worst, maybe 5% of slavery, which existed in the South, but we think that's 100% of what was experienced. And as Patrick mentioned, I love the slave narratives because you get firsthand accounts from slaves who experience it themselves, thousands of them, and it's great. And you'll get the good, you'll get the bad, ugly, everything about it, but it'll give you a fuller view because it's not. There's no agenda behind it. It's just people telling what they remember of their history. There's no political motivation. So if someone experienced bad things, they'll tell you that. If they experience good things, they'll tell you that. And it just gives a more accurate view than the abolitionist pamphlets and things of that sort. And the Republican Party are the ones who government education, as you know in my book, really started for reconstructing the South to make them loyal. They didn't want to fight another civil war. They said we have to make everyone the same in New England. We can't be separate states. We'll have to think as one nation so we don't fight another war like this. It's the plan is peace there. But they're the ones that controlled education. And of course, they want to justify what they did. And they needed to demonize the South and portray all of slavery as so evil that the government in the North is justified in doing what they did. And so that's why they really enhance and hit on the evils of slavery. And as I said, it picked up again in the 1950s, really, after everyone passed away. Because you still had slave owners, you still had slaves. People knew these individuals, they could ask them and they knew what it was like. But once that generation dies off, you can easily rewrite the history, which is where it really kicked in at that time as well. So and that's why I like another reason I used a lot of Northern abolitionists. I used a lot of Europeans. I did use Southerners, but I used slaves. I wanted to use unbiased sources that, if anything, would say slavery is worse than it was and show all these different examples of people who observed it that are all saying something drastically different than what we are taught in schools today. And so slavery is not any one thing. And my book is biased intentionally. It's to try to counter the bias that we're taught in schools. So I'm trying to take the better examples where really slavery was neither everything is portrayed in my book or what we hear in school. It's both of those and some in the middle. And yeah, so I just wanted to show the other side that, there was a lot of family type relationships with slaves. They weren't they weren't mistreated. A lot of them were much freer than we are today. A lot of them enjoyed slavery, didn't want it to end because they were being taken care of. They didn't have much to worry about at all. Everything's paid for, all their expenses are cared for, and they really live carefree lives compared to modern people who are under these busy, hectic schedules and work and always worried about money and our kids, all that. And they had these close-knit family units that's they were content and it's hard to imagine with the portrayal that we get in school. So I wanted to counter that and say we're not presenting this accurately, even though I don't agree with slavery. We shouldn't be lying about it. And also, I'm writing a book that's defending the South, so I want to give them every say that they can and tell the whole truth instead of the little bit of information we're given.
Right. Like a lawyer. A lawyer has to present even
Right.
the best cases from his side in order to get rid of all bias between either side.
Mhm.
And I do find it ironic that socialists will hate private slavery than endorse public slavery.
Right.
They would love the
As
life
long as
where all
everyone's
their
equal, as long as everyone's equally a slave, I think they're okay with it. That's what it is. They see the inequality of someone being a slave and someone not being a slave. They don't like that. They more prefer, as C.S. Lewis said, bring everyone down, no one special, all equal to the lowest common denominator. And they're okay with that. Um, so I think
Uh,
that's the mindset of why they're okay with everyone being a slave compared to only some.
yeah, just continuing on with this topic, I'd like to ask you what you'd say to somebody who would tell you that the war was all about slavery and that the only reason for the war was slavery, because you do cover that excellently in your book also.
Thank you. I mean, that's tough because I spent like 100 pages on that subject, I think. What I'd say is the winner writes the history. What you've been presented, because I accepted that for years, is maybe a half dozen pieces of evidence or arguments to form that conclusion. And you don't know what you don't know. So there's hundreds of speeches, newspaper articles, secession documents, all that kind of stuff that would go against what you're saying. So you have to take a small, limited amount of data to drive your conclusion and be ignorant of everything else. And also, that's why I had the chapter, Old Times They Are Not Forgotten, the Union Before Lincoln. Because if you go in, understand American history up to 1860, and you have that perspective, Jeffersonian democracy, and of the Union going into 1860, then you can see what the South was doing. And you can see when slavery was an issue, it was connected to states' rights. And you can see all the other issues that led to secession. But you have to go from the time period and the people that you're investigating. You can't come from a modern nationalistic viewpoint and read back into history. You have to go back into history, see where they came from, the generation before, what's their mindset, And if you do that, you can very easily see that slavery was an issue, but states' rights was a much larger issue that was connected to slavery. And then you have all these other issues. Lincoln's call for volunteers, especially in the Upper South. But to say it's all about slavery or slavery led to secession just does not stand up to all the information. And I've debated online, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of times with, you know, many people that are very adamant that secession was over slavery. And a lot of them, you ask them, they'll always say, oh, all the secession documents mention slavery. Well, there's only four that directly mention it. I quote, I think 14. They're completely ignorant of all those other ones. And they don't know how to put it in the context of 1860 America because they've been taught from a modern nationalistic view of people who were taught the generation before them. And it kind of just perpetuates a misconception and not handling the historical data as you should from the time period. And you look at it from the 1860 perspective, you have it all, you'll come to a very different understanding. And again, I'd say there's so many arguments, so many causes that you can't place on any one cause. And when slavery is involved, states' rights is the more prominent one. But with the Upper South too, coercion is the main driving force. You know, they stayed in the Union. It was when Lincoln decided to coerce those Southern states back into the Union. And that's the modern nationalistic blind obedience to the state does not understand how much that changes a government from a government of free will, of free people, to one of slaves. And that's what the Upper South left for. And that had nothing to do with slavery. It had to do with Lincoln transforming a union of consent and self-government into one of coercion and force, as they had in Europe. And they said, we're not going to be part of that. We're going to, and they told him up front, they said, we're going to stay in the union. We're going to help you bring the Cotton States back into the union. But if you try to coerce them, you try to force them to obey you and not allow them self-government, we're going to fight on their side. And he didn't listen to them, and they did, and it led to the war.
Right. And a lot of people say that the Confederacy was the aggressor during the whole war, but really, uh, I believe, and I don't remember exactly the source for this, but I've heard that before the war even started, they had sent peace diplomats to the capital to speak with Lincoln, and they had been sent away multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of people will point to the Battle of what was it, Fort Sumter,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll say that was the beginning of the war, which is ironic to me because not one person died during it.
Right,
Only during the ceremony where there was an accident,
right.
which isn't even counted. Uh, but yet, even before Fort Sumter, they had already gotten into a firefight at Pensacola, but they don't like to point to this one because it's said that the Union shot first at the
Hmm.
Confederate troops.
Yeah. I think if a state secedes, their property is theirs. So it was kind of more of a Norse already invading and not allowing them to go. And as Lincoln said, you know, as long as you pay your tariffs, you're fine, but we're going to sit there and collect tariffs, which is where the shots were fired in the fort. It was to protect the in Fort Sumner. And yeah, the South, I think, allowed northern boats to go replenish, bring food to the fort, and all these, the commander was friends with Beauregard. They were interacting. It's not like they were even at war locally. And so it's just you allow a people to leave the Union, like the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln would not allow them to leave. And there was some in the Deep South that thought if they started the war, it helped the Upper South join them. And so there was that push. But ultimately, it comes down to Lincoln not allowing them to have their property when they allow them to leave and saying we're still going to collect the tariffs. And
Right, and you
there's no
mentioned
war
the
if he allows them to leave. They leave peacefully their new country, and he didn't allow that, and he said he wouldn't in his speech.
mhm. You mentioned the Tariff of Abominations. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, yeah, we should mention tariffs as a whole. Lorenzo and Lincoln, I think it was Lincoln Unmasked or the real Lincoln. He points out there was multiple tariffs throughout American history, and I think it was in 1824, if I remember correctly, and they wanted to jack up the tariffs. What the South is paying somewhere around 75, 80% of that tariff, which the federal government, that's one thing we should point out. The federal government did not directly tax people. It had enough through tariffs because it was operating as it was supposed to constitutionally before it became a nation under Lincoln. And so there's very few taxes to upkeep the government because the government's very small. And at this time, the South is paying, yes, somewhere I think it's around 75% of the national tax. But most of that income is going towards the North to support their industrial pursuits and um, to help them in various ways. And the South is saying, this is somewhat theft. We're paying the majority of the taxes, and it's going to benefit the North. And so that's one thing. An argument DiLorenzo points out is that definitely angered the South to increase the taxes because the whole South is against it. Decades before the Civil War, they split the Confederacy. Southern states are against it, and the Northern states are for it because they're getting free money and the South is paying for it. And Lincoln wanted to increase tariffs to the highest it would ever been on the eve of the war. And so that was a major part of the South leaving because it's somewhat like taxation without representation. They're saying we don't want to pay for this. We're not benefiting from it, but you're forcing it upon us anyway. And they're basically, just stealing from the South, which is another reason I think DiLorenzo's absolutely right. The North was really a lot of them were saying, okay, let the South go. This is their form of Declaration of Independence. Allow them to leave. They should have that self-government. And then people in the North started pointing out what would happen to the tariffs and to their income. And they said, okay, well, we can't do this because they'll put a full stop on our government. So we really can't allow them to go, especially Lincoln and the Republicans who had a lot of transcontinental railroads and different projects that they wanted to fund through tariffs like the tariff of abomination that the South really was upset about, and anything to raise the tariff because it's basically just saying South give the North money for no reason at all. And then they're forced they get the higher tax from the European goods, so then they have to buy them from the North. It's just a form of theft, and everyone kind of knew it. And so obviously the South was upset, and obviously the North wanted to keep it going because they're getting free money.
Right. And I find it interesting that you're from Vermont and you make this amazing book about defending Dixie. And it reminds me of one of the people you quoted, Lysander Spooner, who was from New England. And he was also an anarchist. And yet he wrote the pamphlet No Treason in favor of the Confederacy and their right to secede.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
what,
I mean, there was support in the North, and that's DiLorenzo again does a great job showing how it was suppressed. How many people thousands were jailed, imprisoned, deported. A lot of things happened to suppress free speech. And a lot of the people in the North were for the South as a general rule, at least for their principles. It's not like it's a North-South thing completely. Just like there's a lot of people in the South that were pro-Union that wanted to stay in the Union. I think every state except for South Carolina gave at least a regiment to the North to fight from the Southern states because they were pro-Union. And yeah, it's not anyone that's for those principles. That's why I tried to quote a lot of New England founding fathers too, Noah Webster and John Adams, speaking to the principles that the South stood for and showing them on the side of the South as well. It's not just like Southern slaveholders that are trying to find an excuse to hold on to slaves, which you hear a lot. It's not, it's kind of the principles of a free libertarian type society that existed in America before the Civil War. Then we became the centralized bureaucracy controlling state that we are.
right. And one of the arguments I've heard is when they say that the South seceded for slavery, I respond with, Well, they were literally being offered the Corwin Amendment. They would have gotten the Corwin Amendment
Mm,
if they had stayed. They could have kept slavery. And then they say, oh, no, they secede because they wanted to expand slavery even
right,
further than it
right.
was, even though there was no hint that they wanted to do that. And they'll reference groups like the Knights of the Golden Circle as if they were legitimate
Everyone.
assets of the government.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great point. And as I point out in my book, the upper South, a lot of them, some of them said slavery's more protected in the North because they have protection for runaway slaves, which if they formed the Confederacy, they wouldn't. They have the ability to go out into the West with their slaves, which they wouldn't if the Confederacy left, because that'd now be the America. So they're giving out the opportunity and chance to bring slaves west. Supposedly that's a reason. It was completely legal within the states, like the Corwin Amendment. No one, the fight was over, slavery was over the Western territories. And that's why I think it's important that I point out in the Southern Democrat platform, they said it's not about if slavery extends, it's about do these states have the option, whether, and I highlight it or italicize it, whether or not their states accept slavery. The point is that the states have the right to choose, not the federal government. Because once you have the federal government allow this decision over slavery or anything else, it's going to expand. Just like they said, if we allow them to go in one area, they're going to go into 10 other areas, which is what founding fathers, North and South, had warned Southern people. And that's why you get historians like that radical pro-North, well-known historian. I can't think of his name right now, that I quote, but he said the South hadn't changed. They were the same from the founders, and that's all they sought to do was keep what the Republic was originally. It was the North that sought to expand the central power, where the federal government was now going to decide all these different issues that used to be in the role of the state. And as the South said, once you do that, even your New England founding fathers will tell you they're going to expand into the monstrosity that it's become today. And so they were just choosing slavery as the issue that the centralizing forces of America had tried decades before. And that's why I go through all those examples. And Tom Wood's book is great. Bank of America, different disputes that happen between state and federal, where the federal is trying to expand, the states always fought back. And so in 1860, that issue was slavery in the Western territories. And it's just this is the first time we had a Lincoln to have it lead to a war.
Right, and they had nearly entirely, well, since then, since the Civil War, it's basically been entirely abrogated. The 10th Amendment that
Mhm.
states have any rights,
Yeah,
uh, it's basically been entirely rolled over because a state can't really make any type of defense for themselves if they make
right.
a law
They're not the
because,
ultimate sovereigns anymore, whereas they used to be able to be. And like the way you even mention it, the states have rights. It implies that the federal government allows the states rights, whereas before Lincoln, the states delegated those powers to the federal that they could take back at any chance if they were mistreated and
right,
secede or nullify and things like that. So it's more like the federal government was delegated rights before the Civil War. After, the states are allowed certain rights, but the ultimate authority is the federal. And of course, that's just going to end up with more and more central power and where we are today.
right. And I think it expresses something about my thoughts on central power that of all my favorite, of all the periods of American history, my favorite would probably be the pre-American history, pre-United States history, because the colonies of Britain that were formed had vastly different governments in between them. And as that goes on, they slowly fade away due to this centralization that was being done.
Hmm. So, what do you think of the Articles of Confederation?
The Articles of Confederation were hopeful. Yeah, they were hopeful, but they had gotten rolled over. And I think Lysander Spooner, he also said that if the Constitution is powerless to stop the government we have today, or it doesn't even try to stop the government we have today, then it's useless either way.
Hmm.
So the Articles of Confederation, unfortunately, face the same thing, but ultimately it's not paper that really decides whether something lives or goes. It's people.
Right. Right.
People decide. Uh, this might seem odd to bring up, but I watched the Trump movie they have out, and there's a corrupt lawyer in it that says we're not made up of this country isn't made up of laws, it's made up of men. You don't control the laws, you control the men. So
Mhm.
that's
Yeah,
ultimately
and the men decide what the laws say, which is
right, right.
yeah.
Thankfully, we've somehow kept some semblance of a Second Amendment because it's so blatantly clear. If
Well,
you had to go sola scriptura on it,
what I think it is in part is that it's lived out. You know, people own guns and they use them for multiple things, and there's so many, it's widespread that it's hard to then reinterpret the Second Amendment
right?
um, in the way they have the First Amendment and other amendments. So, I mean, even then, you look at separation of church and state that arose and how that's been misused and abused, and they were able to do that. And I think if in their mind, if they can just slowly regulate gun use and get less and less gun owners, it's going to open up the opportunity to then in the future reinterpret it and bring about something new, you know?
And
Right, as more
on the topic of the Articles of Confederation, something I found really interesting about your book is that you sort of put forth the narrative that when the Constitution was originally made, it wasn't imagined as being a replacement for the Articles as much as it was an update. And you even
Hmm.
talk about like George Washington calling the Constitutional Republic the new Confederacy or the
Hmm.
new Confederation. And I found that really interesting. And I'd like if
Yeah,
you could talk about how the view of the Constitution changed with Lincoln and stuff.
yeah. Well, that's a lot. The founders, especially in the South, you know, in that chapter I mentioned how they would refer to us as a confederacy. And America under the Articles of Confederation was the Confederate States of America, which is what the South was doing. But a lot of them, and this is not universal view, but a lot of them just saw it as a continuation or an update, as you said, to the Articles of Confederation, and it is in the Constitution. But yeah, Lincoln changed how we viewed the Constitution, which was now instead of the states and the people who ratified the Constitution said, yeah, you know, we'll delegate and we agree to this union, but we're the ultimate arbiters of our understanding of it, and we're keeping our state governments. The state governments are the primary, and the federal is more the union, a compact that they're joining with these other states for protection and things like that. That's as long as it's beneficial for them. And now the Constitution, since Lincoln, is viewed as the law of the land. This is the highest thing to be interpreted by the federal, and then they then dictate to the states. And the whole mindset is going to change about what the Constitution is and its authority, which then continue to expand. And now the federal government, the Supreme Court, is the highest um, decider of what the Constitution actually says. And so, as Jefferson said, well, the Constitution's no longer, the document itself is no longer the authority. It's these people who are politically appointed, which is why they fight so hard over Supreme Courts. It tells you the right wants Republicans, the left wants Democrats, and liberal and conservative interpreters because it can be interpreted. If you had nine liberals, they're going to tell you the Constitution says something very different than nine Republicans will, and it'll always move in the direction that they want it to move in. And that's a thing under Lincoln, whereas before the Union, the states are the primary, and the federal is just rendering its opinion. It's a union, it's a compact, it's not this above constitution everyone's forced under, you know, sort of thing. So in some ways it's good, I guess. Depending on the state you're in, it can be beneficial because it's bringing the whole union in, so it prevents one state from being worse. But yeah, it's a drastic change in the whole view of the Constitution and the way the state and federal interact with each other.
like a European Union would be how it would be uh,
Yeah, but
a
a
semblance.
confederation.
Yeah,
And that's why, like, you look at the military, the Civil War, almost everyone was a state militia. They fought, you know, the 13th Virginia, the 14th Virginia. They weren't the Confederate regular army was very small. Same with the North, because most everyone considered themselves a member of their state. That's their government. That's their people. They are joined to this union, but they're joined by the states. So the multiple. That's why war between the states, a lot of Southerners will call it. And I think that's more accurate to the mindset of the people, both North and South at the time. And as the war progressed, it becomes more of a nation thing. You know, Lincoln really did that in after the war. But even at the beginning of the war in the North, it's more a war between states than federal governments.
Right. And a lot of people could tell that the states were, they preferred the decentralization. I mean, if you even look at an interview from Julius Howell, he was a Confederate who lived on long enough to give a vocal interview,
Hmm.
and he said it wasn't slavery, it was states' rights.
Hmm.
And something you brought up in your book was that there were actually black Confederates too.
Hmm.
And I was actually persuaded by a man named H.K. Edgerton to be interested in the Confederacy, and he's a modern black
Oh,
Confederate.
yeah, no, yeah. I've seen some of his videos
Hmm.
with the flag.
Right.
Yeah, one thing they used to, I was watching, I think it was the documentary, Ken Burns documentary, which is like a pro-North Civil War documentary, but I love it. But anyway, it was, I think in 64, and they were still burying people by state. So the casualties after the war, you know, the people from Ohio would be buried here, and Minnesota would be over there. And it was a general who was from Virginia, a slave owner, George Thomas. So he's from Virginia. He's a slave owner fighting for the North, and he was a really successful general out west. And anyway, he said, I'm wholly sick of states' rights, mix them up, start burying them all together. And that's somewhat to me how the mindset changed through the war in the North, especially away from sort of states' rights and more into the nation. So I forget what historian it was, but he went through Lincoln's speeches, and you see Lincoln in 1860 and as he's running in Illinois, and he mentions the Union almost all the time, barely ever mentions the nation. And as the war progresses, each year he's using nation more and more in um, Union less. And by the end of the war, he's almost referring to America as a nation completely. And it really was the change of the mindset that came along with the people as the Republicans and Lincoln wanted and were intending to put that mindset, one nation under God. The Pledge of Allegiance was by a socialist, and it was specifically meant to get the next school children to think of us in terms of a nation instead of a union, which we were, and to eradicate that.
Right. We were only a collection of states, and it's seen in our language by how we even say where we're from. We say we're from the United States. We don't say we're from, oh, Vermont of the
Right.
United States or
Yeah.
Kentucky of the United States. So it's all been very, it'd be like saying, oh, where are you from? And you say, I'm from Europe. I'm from
Right. Yeah.
Africa.
The United Nations, somewhere in there.
Yeah,
Um,
the United
no,
Nations.
it was a Southerner. I forget who I was reading. He pointed out how common do you see the American flag, especially in New England? Like you don't see the state flag at all. People don't even think in terms of that. You know, they think of America. I'm an American, and so everyone flies the American flag. Almost no one has the state flag. I mean, in part because it's really doesn't mean anything anymore. Whereas back then it did, because there's difference between the states because you had decentralization. Now that we're all one and the same, there's not a whole lot of difference between being from Vermont, New Hampshire, or Virginia. Um, Not
Right.
as important as it was back then.
I had done a fictional project where I was writing, I do world building sometimes. I find it interesting. And I was doing a project and I tried finding like a common northern state flag. I was looking at all the flags of the northern states to try and find a common denominator to design something, right?
Yeah,
And they all end up being like this blue seal, this blue
yeah,
banner with a seal,
yeah.
or sometimes they'll have like a mini American flag on their flag, like in Iowa or something.
Hmm.
Or and then it's it's just like a double expression. oh, I'm not my state. I'm American. I'm
All right.
very national, very
Right.
American.
Yeah.
So they tried to centralize the state flag designs for a time to erase the identity of a state to just be, oh, it's just a blue flag with a seal so that you know what government office you're at.
Yeah. It's like they quote John Sherman as the Republicans winning election in their political agenda, which caused the Cotton States to secede. He said, "We want to make men love their country more than their state," and that's what the Republicans did, and obviously they accomplished it, and it's resembled in the flags as well as what you're saying. America comes first. The state is where I happen to live.
Right. It's hard to even imagine a good northern flag off the top of my head because everybody loves the flag for Tennessee, Texas,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe Alabama, Mississippi, that got an update.
Alabama updated theirs, right? But I
I think
think
theirs was updated from a Confederate symbolism to more Confederate symbolism
right,
at some
that's what I
point.
was gonna say. I went and because my dad's in Alabama, and I saw that they did it to another less noticeable Confederate flag, which I love. I'm sure most of
Yes,
the residents don't know. I think I told you about that last time we were talking, how I can put out the actual Confederate flag from the government, not the battle flag, fly it out in Vermont, and no one knows what it is when that's really the Confederate
right,
flag, where the battle flag shouldn't matter, but that's in people's mindset. So,
right. I think it was maybe Georgia that still has just almost exactly the same Confederate flag as the
mm,
national government that
yeah.
it had
What's
way
what's
back then.
Florida's? Is Florida? I think they still have that.
Florida's is I believe it's like a St. Andrew's cross, but
Yeah.
I think it's like more of a Spanish style
Hmm.
for how they do theirs. I forget what they call it, but
Hmm.
even it has a good design. But then I think, what's a good northern flag? Good design up there.
That's interesting. I remember looking at the flags in New England. It's just like you said, they're all the same thing. We have a
Right.
cow in ours, I think, but yeah,
I
the
mean, if
blue
genuinely,
background, the circle.
I like Indiana's flag a little bit. It has a torch, but it's still just a blue banner, and
Yeah.
it has a symbol on it. If you want to go by technical northern states, you can go California, but during the Civil War, it was kind of contested whether California would even be a technically Union or northern state even. So it
They
had
they
southern
sent some
immigrants.
help to the South in New Mexico too. I know some Californians fought in the New Mexico territory for the South, some generals and some volunteers.
Right. There was a lot of
They
southern influence.
they were not the population they were today, obviously. They were
Right.
low.
It was very changed over the years, especially as time went on. I don't know when the gold rush, I believe it happened after the Civil War, right?
I think
Yeah.
so. Was that 1890s? Does that sound
I
right?
believe it happened around the 1890s, and then that's when everybody from the northern states, of course, they were richer by this point,
Mhm.
started immigrating over there and completely
The
changed the culture.
the rails set as well, so you can
Also, the
travel
rails.
there easy,
Yeah, they could travel there much
easier.
easier. So,
They kick the
California,
Indians off their land.
right. California, their flag is probably a residual vestigial flag from when they had more free thinking, but really, if they had been just integrate a little bit sooner, they
Hmm.
might have a plain blue blue
Yeah.
flag with a bear standing on it, and
Yeah.
that's all they get.
That's interesting, man. I'm gonna have to go check out the northern flags now after this.
I may have to as well. I'd like to thank you for doing this interview with us because the book was, I'd say it was a masterpiece in the polemical area because I really genuinely don't see many books that are with so many sources so well done that are so I really do agree with a lot of your opinions. I mean, I don't much disagree. I mean, closest I might even get is to I'm not as high church maybe, but
Mhm.
I would agree on 99% of everything and the sourcing is amazingly done. Uh
Thank you.
well-deserved reviews. I'd recommend people to buy it even after this interview because the interview doesn't even go over half of everything that was covered because there was so much. It's so informationally dense. It's like, protein shake for your brain.
That's yeah, that's why I want to mention, it was my first book and I thought, who's going to listen to me? I really wanted my to support what I was saying. And I want to do it from original sources. And because I feel like the winner writes the history, from debating online, I would make a statement, oh, this secession document says this, or, this about slavery, and people would say, prove it. Where's your evidence? And so that was in my mind. And I want it to be readily available to the reader so that they can read the book, have all that information so that they can go talk with someone else or debate with someone else. And they're going to be able to go back into the book and see all the sources, all the citation. They're going to have all the evidence readily available to be able to defend the South, to defend the views, and that's why it's defending Dixieland because I want to. The South, I
Right,
believe, has been misportrayed, and here's how you can go about
right.
defending them against falsehood, I
To
guess.
even get 1% of a lot of the things that were covered in your book, I had to go before, of course, before I knew about the book. Before I knew, I would have to go to. I was surprised it was even on Reddit because Reddit's such a liberal place, but they have a subreddit called Southern Liberty, and
Really?
it's jam full of pro-Confederate content,
Huh.
and it expresses maybe 5% of the information you could probably get out of this book on a usual every once in a while. You could probably get a lot of things out of it, really. I mean, I picked up so many micro facts and tidbits from it,
Hmm.
including about the usage of the Confederate flag later in history,
Yeah.
how it was used in the military in
All right.
various wars like Vietnam. They couldn't use an American flag much of the time, so they had to use a Confederate flag,
Really?
and in some sense that gave a lot of there were even black soldiers who fought in Vietnam and they'd be happy when they saw a Confederate flag because it
Right.
meant
Yeah.
that Americans were
That.
there who were going to help them out.
Yeah.
And
And,
it
and that's
was
their heritage as well. They're from those southern states as well. It's like a regional
right,
thing.
right,
Whenever I watch a sports game, I could know nothing about them. But if I'm watching UVM, I'm automatically rooting for them just because they're from Vermont. It's
right,
my area, and I'm sure
right,
they had the same thing. One thing I wanted to include in my book, and I didn't, is on the Confederate flag and its portrayal. So if you go back and look at the Ku Klux Klan, all the earliest images, they have American flags. There's two Ku Klux Klans. The white supremacist group started in 1920s in Georgia, and they used the American flag. You look at all the older pictures, it's all American flags. And then the centennial of the Civil War celebration in America is going to happen around 1960, and it's a big deal. Everyone's promoting it, everyone's a part of it, and the Confederate flag is used as a symbol by everyday Americans, North and South. No one has a problem with it. No one associates it with racism or anything like that. It's a reminder of the centennial that they're going to celebrate for the Civil War. Well, the Ku Klux Klan takes that, it's advertisement, and they start using the Confederate flag to give them a better image, give a better portrayal to say, hey, we're not that bad. We're using Confederate flag as well. And around that time, with the civil rights, there's a couple of murders in Mississippi and stuff. And then that is put on the news, and that's the image you see of the Confederate flag with those Ku Klux Klansmen, and then it gets associated across the nation with racism and all that. But it was never
right.
taken like that in America, North or
And
South. It was
and
never used
it's
by the Ku Klux Klan. It's just a promotional thing that they did at that time, and the image stuck, and so
right. And it's
it's too
very
bad.
weird because the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party used the Confederate flag and they were a civil rights party that was
Really,
expressly against the
Ku
uh,
Klux Klan.
well, they were expressly against the segregation. They
Hmm.
were very much in favor of integration, and they used the Confederate flag as their main symbol. You can even look it up. I believe their flag may even include a black and white hand on it, where they're shaking hands, and it's in front of the Confederate flag.
Yeah.
And the flag was also used by the Young Patriots, who were a socialist group in the North which cooperated with the Black Panthers,
Hmm.
which a lot of people don't know about.
Hmm.
And you were talking about the Ku Klux Klan, and I find that interesting because even if you go back to their earliest sources, like the slave narratives, one of my most interested slave narratives I've ever read was slave narrative of Prince Johnson.
Hmm.
And he was a black man from the South who had rode with the Ku Klux Klan because of
Political stuff.
yes, he rode with them because of political stuff. They came to him and they said, "Hey, would you like to ride with us?" And
Right.
he was like, "I'd love to." So
Yeah.
he rides with them, and he's technically the Klan's first black member because
Huh.
he rode with them. But you also look at things like the Pole Bearer speech by Nathan Bedford Forrest at that time,
Yeah.
and it was like if you read that, it's like a proto civil rights speech where it literally says he gives a black woman flowers and kisses her on the cheek, and
Mhm.
it's a totally
And
black
he's supposed to be the
audience.
devil. He's the
He's supposed to
example
be
of
the
the
devil creator of the
Ku Klux
evil
Klan.
white supremacist party, but really he says it's very interesting actually that he gets into it. He says, "We're brothers. Vote the way that you want to vote. Don't feel compelled to vote one way or another."
Mhm.
And the poll bearers, people don't know this either, but they're the predecessor to the NAACP. They're the
Huh.
group that came before the NAACP. And by the time Nathan Bedford Forrest did die, he had many black people go to his funeral. I believe he had thousands of people that went
Uh-huh.
to his funeral because he was a more of an upstanding guy than he's usually portrayed as.
Portrayed. Yeah,
Right,
for sure. And that's there's so much to say there. One thing I remember again, the PBS documentary, they talked about General Sherman of the North shaking hands with a colored person. This is after the war, I think after Appomattox, and they're saying how it astonished people because blacks and whites didn't do that. Well, that's how it was in the North. And, I quote many observers who say in the South, they'd shake hands, they'd interact as if it was nothing. And I think they just interacted more. They were used to each other. And that's why the North, they were the segregationists. Segregation started in the South after it began in the North. They took it because of all the Reconstruction, the carpetbaggers that came down and caused
right,
these
right.
racial wars. Really, the original Ku Klux Klan that Nathan Bedford Forrest was a part of was not the white supremacist Ku Klux Klan. That started in 1920, and it was a political
Right.
group about
And
protecting Southerners, and
yeah,
so that they had a black guy riding with them, it makes perfect sense. Whereas the 1920s Ku Klux Klan, that'd be awkward.
the Klan had been very much I've heard theories about what had happened with it, but they say that it may have been subverted in the sense that it had lost a lot of the members who were in it were being since they had fought against the Yankees and the Unionists and the Carpetbaggers,
Mhm.
they were a target by the Unionists. So Unionists would put on Klan outfits, which are very easy to make because it's
Mhm.
basically a bed sheet. You put
Mhm.
on a bed sheet, and then they went out and did some crime against either black people they didn't like or some minority they didn't like, and
Mhm.
then it would be pinned on the Klan, and then that's why you get the Nathan Bedford Forrest trial where they were trying him for being part of the Klan and it's a terrorist organization and
Right. A way to
they're
bring them
killing
down.
all these innocent people. And then later on, when it becomes the 1920s Klan, there is the white supremacy, the American flags. There's
Yeah.
maybe a small vestigial part of it, which is actually somewhat still Southern that comes back, where I've seen actual pictures of 1920s Klansmen in the South who were probably more on the Southern side who actually did charity for a former slave couple and they bought them a radio to listen to gospel music.
Hmm.
It's kind of a creepy photo because they have to wear the old Halloween costumes type of thing
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
there's this one member who's wearing a Santa mask, and then there's two Klan members, and then there's a radio, a former slave couple. Some people are creeped out, but I find it as a sweet gesture
Hmm.
that they did want to do charity for them.
Hmm.
But the second Klan mostly rose out of Indiana, which is a northern state.
That's what I was going to say. I thought the largest membership was Indiana.
Yeah, yeah, it rose highly out of Indiana, which was not at all the main focus. That would be like, I'm an anti-Yankee imperialist and I'm right right in the middle of Yankee land. We're founded in DC.
Yeah,
We want to
yeah.
kick them out.
There's a pro South book. I cite it or reference it in Dixie. The original KKK, the Federal Union League, I think it is, and I forget the name of the author, but that's a very good book to read to see what was going on in the South that gave rise to the original Ku Klux Klan and how it was protecting Southerners who had no rights and that were being kicked off their land, having it stolen from them, mistreated. And
Right.
there's
The
the
the Union
terrorism that the
troops.
federal government and the occupiers put on the South. It was
Mm.
a reaction to that.
Right. I believe it was said that there is a Tennessee governor who was from the North during Reconstruction. They hated him because he was so corrupt and tyrannical that convinced some of them to help form the Klan
Hmm.
as their prerogative. And of course, as things went on, it was subverted and defiled, unfortunately. But even Prince Johnson, he says that I think there was another lady who also talked about the Klan. You can go through the slave narratives, and there's not just Prince Johnson who rode with the Klan, but there are other black people in the South who said that the Klan was helping keep law and order. They kept the
Hmm.
peace. They were protecting us. They were stopping Unionists who were stealing food
Hmm.
from both black and white
Yeah,
alike because they were robbing their farms and stealing food, so
right.
they would try and kick them out.
And they target the plantations, especially where a lot of the blacks remained on after freedom. And so they
Right,
would
doing
experience
some
it then because they're losing the same out if you steal from their masters, and they'd steal from the slaves as well. And so, yeah,
right. They didn't really have a care for whether someone was free or slaved because
right.
they just wanted to get their wealth extracted from them, so they would steal from either they wouldn't care if they starved.
And that's, I think, the demonization that was intentionally put on the South, not just by abolitionists, but by the Republican Party at large. Like these people are so evil that they don't care to go down and let them starve and steal all their stuff because they're so evil. So in their mind, they justify. Same thing Hitler did with the Jews. If you can portray them as this cancer on society, well, it's okay to confiscate their wealth, to do what you want with them because they're a danger. And we did the same thing with the South, and it's all propaganda to justify actions wanted to be taken by a political party, in this case, the Republicans, and to steal and extract their wealth, because that's absolutely what they did. They eradicated society, they stole their money, they did all things that would normally be considered heinous crimes and inhumane, but it's justified in the mind of the people because we've demonized them, misportrayed them in this way that people then in their mind accept it and there's like, oh no, it's not bad, it's a good, it had to happen. And it's scary because it can be done against any people.
Right, and I found that amazing that the factoid that I that you brought up that in the book that the term the final solution was inspired by I believe Sherman
Sheridan
and
or Sherman, yeah.
yeah, so they inspired the term the final solution, which would be used by the Nazis.
Mhm.
So that's an incredible tidbit for anybody who does want to defend the South
And
because
that's
that's terrible.
Yeah, and you read what they said about the Native Americans. We need to eradicate these people. And they tell the chiefs, they said, you either need to become like us. I think it was like, capitalist and loyal to the government, or we're going to eradicate you. That's the two options. That's what the South told them they were going to do. And then you look at the way the South treated them, it's completely different. But in our mindset, because the winner writes the history, we would automatically associate the negative treatment of Native Americans with the South and not the North, when the opposite is true. And it's that Hitler, that mindset of demonizing any group that is not like you and that you want to wipe out, whether it's to build railroads across the country and get rid of Indians or Jews in Germany. It's dangerous stuff.
Right, and the way they do it is by shaving off the minorities on the back of the end. Slowly, slowly, slowly. It's just like you said, how the Second Amendment has stayed so long because it's actually in practice by a lot of people.
Which
But
is,
when
oh,
something falls
sorry.
out of practice, when something
Mhm.
gets to, being near where it would just abolish itself, then that's when the government decides it's their great eureka moment
Their
to
time, yeah,
make it illegal. Thank you. Now that it's
yeah.
finally becoming over, finally
And
now that it's going away on its own, I will now declare it illegal.
right.
Things such as segregation with the Civil Rights Act, that was, the state, you can't really say the state was making it pass out, but over time, businesses were just not doing it anymore because they wanted to earn more money and they didn't really
Mhm.
care.
Mhm.
It wasn't even the cultural practice of the South before the Civil War to really do segregation
Right.
as
Yeah.
much. So they didn't really care. They were starting to do away with it. And then the government steps in and says,
Mhm.
well, guys, I think I know what we need to do.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Uh, what I was going to say, that's why I love the customs of the Middle Ages, how the laws were few and lived out, so it's very difficult for the government to come in and do the sort of things that they do today.
right. And that's why it is so important to defend Dixie, defend secessionist movements, defend people who are usually hated. Because if you don't defend anybody who's hated by the modern system, then it's going to end up that you're going to be put off the chopping block and you'll be one of the
Right.
hated
Yeah, you're next.
inevitably. Yeah, you'll
Yeah.
be next if you don't defend anybody, no matter
If you
what.
allow
So,
them to take out these groups slowly, they're just going to keep continuing. And it's
right,
I consider
culling the
it a
herd.
wake-up call too. Like why, you know, I think we had this conversation with monarchy, why am I being lied to about something? There's something behind it, and you're willing to search into other areas and dig for truth. And that's a very dangerous thing for the powers generally. An educated citizenship is going to question what they're told and taught instead of have that blind obedience that Lincoln wanted.
Right, and that is why your book is so golden and needed because if we want to defend something that's hated, it needs to be given with a good explanation, which you
Mhm.
give. And if we want to remain free, we have to defend things that are hated oftentimes, unless we consider freedom to just do whatever the status quo is, then go wild.
Yeah, and that's one thing to focus on equality, but we're not treating all groups equal, especially throughout history. They're not given the same chance and defense as various groups that we prefer today are allowed. And so that's an inconsistency.
Right, right. It is an inconsistency, and as time goes on, if we don't stand up against these things, uh, there's nothing left that we could do. So it is good that there are authors that are just like you, Jeb Smith, certain, alias Isaac Bishop, and there are groups like what me and Jason have here where we want to
Right.
progress these ideas. We're willing to talk to anybody. Is something I wanted to bring up. We're willing to talk to anybody. We're not just an ANCAP channel or a reactionary channel. We're open to socialist, communist, atheist, creationist, evolutionist, everybody. But generally, the people who we get the most here are radical, great thinkers like
Mm.
you guys, like Walter Block, like David Friedman, the co-author that Walter Block had, Jonathan Lubin.
If you're open to everyone and you allow everyone to speak, you're probably going to get the people who aren't allowed to speak in other places, and they're going to
Correct.
gravitate towards you. Where those other people are allowed to speak anywhere, there's few outlets that are more allow everyone to. So the people who don't get the, yeah, don't get
They
their
they
opinions
prefer a
heard so much.
place they prefer a place where not everybody can speak. So
Yeah,
they can speak
that's
more.
true. Yeah.
But I I'm very much looking forward to more future content with you, more future discussion, because no matter what, there's more work to be done
Hmm.
for the freedom of people, for the advancement of people's souls, for the artistic development of people. There's always more.
Hmm.
And with defending Dixie, I find that to be a great thing because if you're trapped in if you're cornholed into one group, then inevitably you're going to lose a lot of cultural diversity, which should remain because the more diverse a type of market is, the more options you'll get, the more it's going to evolve into something better. So I do want to thank you for coming on to this.
Thank you again for having me, and I hope we get to do this again on a medieval panel. I think there was some
Yes,
discussion or possible political future ideas.
yes,
One thing I wanted to let both of you guys know, if you're interested, I'm now on LinkedIn, and it's just Jeb Smith on LinkedIn, and I'm all the podcasts, all my articles I'm publishing quite frequently are placed on there. Some of them are material from the Civil War, that have been written or I'm writing, and there's a lot of medieval and other ideas that if you want to keep up with me, that's a good place to do it now. And it also
Uh,
has links to my books.
that's
yes.
great.
We
If you'd like, we could put your LinkedIn in the description of the YouTube video.
Sure, yeah, that'd
yeah,
be
that would
awesome.
be
Do you want me
great.
to email you it?
Yeah, or I
Sure,
could probably find it too, but
Okay, yeah. All right. That'd be
you can
awesome.
email it to us for a backup, but
Mhm.
uh, we're very grateful, and I think I'll send you some of my resources too. I actually have my own website that I do some light publishing to. So
Nice.
I could give you that, and I could also
Absolutely.
give you some other articles that I think you might find interesting.
Cool.
All
Awesome.
right,
Well, it was
great.
great talking with you guys again.
it was a
You
very
as
nice
well.
discussion.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank
day.
you. You as well.